is Pritha. My story in this community is one of complete gratefulness. Little backstory. My mom was diagnosed with terminal disease in 2008, and then in 2013 she had a massive stroke where she fried out 77% of her brain. And for the last 5 years, and definitely for the last 2.5, I'm not even sure if I'm wearing pants or what day it is, because we are so deeply embedded in primary caregiving, my father and I, which is like basically fighting emergencies and keeping my mother alive. Now, once my mom decided that she was actually okay and she was going to teach herself how to walk and how to read again and how to eat again, my dad and I were at a bit of a loss because we were used to putting out this fire and saving this life, and now what were we going to do? It was kind of easier for my dad because he had retired. For my dad, he just kind of a little bit more can go with the flow, given that he's been married to my mother for as many decades as he has been. But my experience with this newness, this new mother I have, is still one that's sort of tinged with emergency. And I realized that, you know what, I can't really spend the rest of our lives together in this emergency state. That doesn't sound very healthy. So I came back to New York and I was like, okay, I got to get a job in this space. By training, I'm not trained to do anything useful in this space at all. So I started to go to a lot of family caregiving support groups, and they were largely terrible. And I went to a lot of events, and then I found Diversability. And it was the first place I felt remotely seen and accepted for my experience, which I found amazing because I hadn't really been thinking about myself for the last 2.5 years. I wasn't really a person. I was a function. And it was such a relief for me to piece my new self together in this community, because my old friends were like, hey, how's it going? Love your hair. And I was like, what? That you love my hair? Or like, it's good to see you. Now let's go to Mexico. Like, none of that made sense. And in this community, I started talking about some of the goals and dreams I had. And one of them was to be less embarrassed and be less ashamed about the fear and the sadness I felt around what had happened to my mother and how my father and I were dealing with it. I just couldn't piece together happiness yet. And in this community, I was allowed to just be myself. In that space of being myself, I decided to apply for a couple of fellowships, and I was lucky to receive the Air New Voices Fellow in 2015, which is a public media, public radio fellowship. And what I wanted to explore in that space was, where are these stories of family caregivers, particularly looking at family caregivers that are sort of erased. So I'm South Asian, I'm not married, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a surgeon. That's really difficult for my community. Like that poses a lot of issues. Did I say I don't have children? That's just like very impossible. It's because my family tends to be more conventional than other families. I had to parse in ways that were largely invisible, right? At the same time, I noticed that these other invisible caregivers were non-cisgendered people, transgendered people, LGBTQI people, but they, for example, had to resume their biological imperatives in their primary family structure, and that seemed kind of unfair. They had to exchange their identity between the ones that they had made for themselves as they grew into the adults that they are and the ones that they were required to be in order to be seen. So that was kind of troublesome. I wrote some stories, people liked it, they gave me a fellowship. At the same time, I realized the reason my dad and I literally went berserk was because we just didn't have the technology that we needed at hand to mitigate and exist in harmony with fear and hope, right? So what does that look like at a very basic level? My dad needs larger font, you guys. He's 75 years old. Our caregivers might need things that are not just in English because they speak Creole and Portuguese as their primary tongues. And I decided, I could probably maybe, because I'm not a technologist, balsamic or pen and paper code this. And I did. And I made 3 things, and they were pretty used. Like all of my friends now with all of their ill family members are using this. I mean, I'm certainly not a programmer, But the question I had was like, how come people are not making things that are like useful right away, right? So that's how I got into family caregiving technology. And I can say that in the diversability community, where I've met entrepreneurial friends like Quentin, soul friends like Priya and Tiffany, real life friends now like Sean and Emily, Christopher, a number of other people, everybody understands exactly what I'm talking about, because what I'm talking about is accessibility. Here, I'm trying to access myself as my mother's new daughter, as my mother is my new mother. And my father is sort of, his whole life he's sort of been like, well, so what are you going to do, because you're not a lawyer or a surgeon. And now I finally feel that my father sees me in a way that he might have been waiting a very, very long time, to sort of lay his eyes upon something and recognize. And I'm pretty certain I wouldn't have done that without this community.